So now that we're all here, I can finally welcome Tim Thornton, Professor of Philosophy and Mental Health at University of Central Lancashire, to Royal Holloway to give a talk called Bootstrapping Conceptual Normativity, ? And lead it to you, Tim.
Lovely, thank you very much. So this is there are two things that I do in life. My day job, as it were, is being a philosopher of psychiatry. And I'm a kind of jobbing philosopher of psychiatry. I'm a generalist. So the philosophers of psychiatry really divide between those of whom have picked out particular niches and those of whom are kind of generalist and operate across the board. And I'm the latter sort, bringing to bear an interest in sort of anti-reductionist philosophy in a number of different areas. And one of the things that creeps into that, one of the influences is a fondness, though a lack of purity when it comes to it, but a fondness for Wittgenstein. So this is a talk which is basically thinking about Wittgenstein and thinking about Hannah Ginsborg's paper on primitive normativity. But just because it struck me as kind of dramatic and interesting, I thought I would begin by outlining an argument from Jerry Fodor. In fact, the dialectic of the talk won't depend on Fodor. I want to start and finish with a bit of Fodor, just because Fodor's one of my favorite philosophers, because he accepts crazy conclusions, and that seems to me to be an enormous virtue in philosophers. And that's a way of thinking about what we might want by way of a response to Fodor's argument. And the question mark in the title of my talk today is partly because I think we don't get really what we do want with response to Fodor's argument, and we don't get it from Hannah Ginsborg either. So that's sort of the kind of the general conceptual package. So I'll start with, I don't know, 5 slides looking at Fodor's dramatic argument against the possibility of learning concepts from damn, book's gone out of my head just for the second, but it's the version 2 of the obvious book, The Language of Thought. There it is. And that will set up a kind of shopping list that one might have in philosophy. And Hannah Ginsborg provides one way of trying to sort of go shopping with respect to that requirement, that desire. And what I'll try and do is suggest that Ginsborg's notion of primitive normativity can be interpreted in one of 2 different ways. She, I think, has to interpret it in one way, which I'm going to call a no-conception version of primitive normativity. She's got to do that because of the other things that she's doing with her account, but I don't think it's a satisfactory account. However, it leaves space for a local conception of primitive normativity, which might provide one with momentary relief from some of the anxiety that Fodor naturally gives us. And so the final part of the talk is to think about how primitive a conception of primitive normativity might be. That's the story. I don't know what the local tradition is. I'm happy to stop if I say something crazy that nobody understands. Then I'm happy to be interrupted. But one of the features about sharing screens, for example, is that I can't see the chat box. So you'd need to unmute and just say something to me. Okay, so when I put things in Times as a font, they're quotations. And here's the argument, the lovely argument that Fodor gives against the very idea of being able to learn concepts. So I'm going to read out 4 steps and then summarize the shape of the argument. So this is what Fodor says. The experience from which a concept is learned must provide inductive evidence about what the concept applies to. Perhaps cow, the concept cow, is learned from experience with cows. If so, then experiences with cows must somehow witness that it's cows that the concept cow applies to. This internal connection between concept learning and epistemic notions like evidence is the source of the strong intuition that concept learning is some sort of rational process. It contrasts sharply with the kinds of concept acquisition where, for example, a concept is acquired by surgical implantation or by swallowing a pill or by hitting one's head against a hard surface, etc. Intuitively, none of these is concept learning, but any or all of them might eventuate in concept attainment. So in other words, if we're searching for some notion of concept learning, we're searching for more than just concept attainment. And he continues, there is, I think of this as a kind of second step of the argument, there is, I think, a pretty general consensus in the cognitive science literature about what makes a kind of concept acquisition a kind of concept learning. Roughly, it's that concept learning is a process of inductive inference. In particular, that it's a process of projecting and confirming hypotheses about what the things the concept applies to have in common. So step 3. Consider any concept that you're prepared to accept as primitive, the concept green, as it might be. Then ask, what is the hypothesis, the inductive confirmation of which constitutes the learning of that concept? Well, to acquire a concept is at least to know what it's the concept of. That is, what's required of things that the concept applies to. So maybe learning the concept green is coming to believe that the concept green applies to all and only green things. It's surely plausible that coming to believe that is at least a necessary condition for acquiring the concept green. Notice, however, assuming Fodor's proprietary brand of representationalist theory of mind, a token of the concept green is a constituent of the belief that the concept green applies to all and only green things. Step 4, a fortiori, nobody who lacked the concept of green could believe this. Nobody who lacked the concept of green could so much as contemplate believing this. A fortiori, on pain of circularity, coming to believe this can't be the process by which the concept green is acquired. Likewise, mutatis mutandis for any other primitive concept. So the first book, Language of Thought 1, concluded quite correctly that no primitive concept can be learned. If one then throws in the empirical assumption that most of the concepts one has are primitive, which is to say not definable, you get the consequence that most of the concepts one has can't be learned. In fact, in Language of Thought 2, he generalizes beyond the primitive concepts, but the primitive concepts will do for today. And this, I think, is a kind of a summary of the argument, just in case you've not read it before. So it's concept learning, not concept acquisition, is a rational process. The only plausible rational process is hypothesis formation and testing, but that requires the conceptual representation of the hypothesis, which presupposes possession of the concept to be learned. So concept learning is impossible. That's sort of the story. And I think it's a really interesting, powerful argument. And what makes Fodor such a great philosopher is that he accepts the conclusion. But thinking about it, well, although premise 1 looks obligatory, the idea that concept learning is a rational process, the conclusion is dire. And that raises the question of whether we could question the intermediate steps or not, which in turn suggests a kind of general motivating rationale for my talk today. So as I said at the start, it's not so much that I'm engaging with Fodor, I'm just using a particularly strong statement of a worry, namely Fodor's statement of that worry, to provide the kind of foundation for thinking about whether there might be a primitive form of normativity, a primitive form of correctness as applied to linguistic meaning and mental content. I suppose I should also say at this point that, of course, whilst I've been a philosopher, there's been a kind of sea change. So everybody coming out of a kind of Wittgensteinian background used to think that concepts were essentially normative, that semantics were normative. And there's been a backlash against that. For the sake of today's paper, I hope that doesn't matter. I hope the fact that I'm old-fashioned about this and think of concepts as having a sui generis form of semantic normativity isn't a problem for thinking about learning concepts, because it seems to me that learning concepts does look to be normative. If learning is a rational activity, there is an aim involved, which seems to be captured in a normative notion. So that helps us ask the question, is there some primitive form of semantic normativity? And the one I'm going to talk about is Hannah Ginsborg's influential notion of primitive normativity. But it's worth mentioning in passing that there are other middle grounds available between the kind of world that Fodor wishes to inhabit and the kind of Wittgensteinian world of full-blown conceptual semantic normativity. Ginsborg's is one way of trying to find a foothold into full-blown conceptual normativity using something more primitive normativity, as she describes, and I will summarize for you. But another couple of interesting places one could look. David Bell's reading of the schematism, where he connects Kant's third critique to Wittgenstein to try to come up with a non-rule governed account of the application of rules, seems to me to be similarly trying to occupy a middle ground. And there's a really fascinating description by Cora Diamond of mathematical necessity, in which she attempts to argue for a non-conventionalist account of necessity, but still suggesting that something is grasped in mathematical proofs that requires going beyond an understanding of primitive counting. So she suggests that an aspect dawns such that one comes to think that 7 plus 5 doesn't just generally equal 12, but it must equal 12. So Cora Diamond's account of mathematical proof seems to me to be a similar sort of middle ground, but I'm not going to talk about Bell or Diamond today. So I'm thinking about a 2011 paper, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. Let's see, where are we? We're on slide 11. I think I have something like 26 slides. So we're whizzing through, which will give us lots of time for questions, which is lovely. So again, a quotation in Times. This is a quotation from Ginsborg. She says, "While my approach is partly reductionist, in that it aims to reduce facts about meaning to facts that are, in a sense, more primitive, it does not attempt a reduction of meaning to facts conceived purely naturalistically." So in other words, Ginsborg isn't in the same game as Fodor in such books as Psychosemantics, where Fodor famously provides us, delightfully, exceptionally, Fodor provides us with an argument for philosophical naturalism, which is basically, if semantics are real, they're really something else, i.e. they're reducible to physics. So that's the Fodor aim. For something to be real, it's either on the basic list that physicists will eventually come up with, or it's reducible to something on that basic list that physicists will come up with. That's how Fodor understands naturalism in philosophy. Ginsborg is reductionist in one sense. She aims to reduce facts about meaning to more primitive facts, but she's not aiming to reduce facts about meaning to physical facts, or, for example, teleosemantic facts, like Millikan, say, or David Papineau. Bedrock, she continues, on this approach is located below the level of facts about meaning, but, as we shall see, it's still irreducibly normative, and hence it remains above the level of mere behavioral responses and their psychological concomitants. So she's going to provide us with a kind of reductionist account of semantics, of conceptual normativity. Ginsborg is, like me, old-fashioned. She believes in semantic normativity. But she's going to give a grounding for it, or a way into it, which is still normative in some sense, but more primitively normative than the conceptual. Now, just saying that this is what she aims to do doesn't yet help us have a sense of what it's going to look like, but that's going to become clear as we go on. I'm just going to use for the moment the first line of this slide. So one of the things that is important about Ginsborg is that her account of primitive normativity comes as a response to Saul Kripke's very famous, strong misinterpretation of Wittgenstein. And I want to say one of the reasons why I'm really interested in Ginsborg's paper is that she promises to come up with a novel response to Kripke. And my entire life, people who've worked in a kind of Wittgensteinian tradition have attempted to come up with responses to Kripke. And I really thought we were done. I didn't think that there was conceptual space for another one. So it's independently interesting that Ginsborg is going to provide a response to Kripke. But it also turns out that that's going to be important because that shapes her account of primitive normativity. In other words, in providing a response to Kripke, Ginsborg's hand is forced when it comes to characterizing primitive normativity. Now, I've no idea whether everybody's familiar with Kripke on Wittgenstein, so I've got a slide which provides a recap. So I'm going to jump from this slide to this one, which is a recap on Kripke on Wittgenstein. And perhaps everyone is familiar with the story of Kripke reading Wittgenstein, and deeply irritatingly for every Wittgensteinian in the land, coming up with a really pithy summary that produced a dramatic response. Kripke is, for me, like Fodor, a philosopher who is delightful for accepting a crazy conclusion, because the argument that he offers seems to come to that crazy conclusion. Now, what Kripke does is he provides a way of reading the central sections, paragraphs 139 to 239, and in fact 239 onwards, the private language argument of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. Kripke thinks that the rule-following considerations and the private language argument all form a kind of organic whole. But rather than this being based on a very subtle reading of the text, he reconstructs an argument as it strikes him. And the argument is to the effect that there are no facts about meaning, that there are no facts about what one means by words, and hence about mental content either. Now, I won't go into the whole of his argument. I'll just give you a sense of it. He takes an example, the question, what justifies the claim that answering 125 is the correct response to the question, what does 68 plus 57 equal? So what justifies giving the obviously correct answer 125? And he builds in a couple of simplifying assumptions. In fact, there's a third assumption that I'll mention. Firstly, that what correct means when we're considering this example now is accordance with the standards of one's previous use of these signs. In other words, what one meant by them in the past. So he says that plus, as I intended to use that word in the past, denoted a function which, when applied to the numbers I call 68 and 57, yields the value 125. In other words, the notion of correctness is sort of idiolectic. It's tied to how you understood these words before. And then a second simplifying assumption is that one's never calculated this particular result before. I think he assumes that we've never counted above 57. But I mean, we can just come up with an arbitrarily high number so that this second assumption seems plausible. And then there's a third assumption I haven't mentioned here, which is that he thinks that the answer has to be normative in this sense, that it's got to give you the idea that 125 is the correct thing to say, not just that it's what you're disposed to say. Facts about our education might causally and dispositionally dispose us to say 125. But Kripke doesn't think that that's enough to answer the question he intends, which is what makes it right to say that? Now, so there's the question. And then this being a skeptical argument, there's a skeptical ringer. And in this case, the skeptical ringer is the possibility that in the past, we meant by the plus sign or the word plus, we meant the mathematical function quas, which is a deviant rule, which is defined as mapping the plus function until you get to this sum, at which point 68 quas 57 equals 5. That's the correct answer to the quas summing of 68 and 57. And now the way in which Kripke connects this back to Wittgenstein is to suggest that there is nothing about one's past performance that forces 125 as the correct response. And the sorts of things he considers, I mean, you might think such things as, hang on, by plus, we could define plus as counting along the number line, a certain number of numbers. And then we count along the next set of numbers. So 68, you count up to 68. Then you start counting at 69, you count 57 more, and then that gives you an answer. What's the answer? It's 125. And Kripke says, yes, but even if you said to yourself the definition that by plus, I mean the following procedure using the number line, perhaps those words as you said them to yourself meant that, except when the numbers concerned are 68 and 57, in which case the correct way of responding to the number line is just to count up to 5. And the conclusion from this that Kripke draws is that there is nothing about one's past that will be sufficient to justify the normative notion that 125 is the correct response. Because everything that we said or did seems to stand in need of an interpretation, and hence we end up with a regress of interpretations, never delivering the grounding that we seem to need. So that's Kripke's argument in a nutshell. It's an argument for meaning skepticism. It's based on a reading of Wittgenstein, and built into it is a notion of normativity. Now, I've always assumed that normativity was a premise that Kripke just accepted. I took him to be old-fashioned like me and Hannah Ginsborg, and to think that semantics were normative. Martin Kutsch has a different view. He thinks that Kripke uses semantic normativity as part of a package of ideas, all of which collapse via this argument. So it's not the case that Kripke himself is, as it were, committed to semantic normativity. I mentioned this in passing. This won't matter to Ginsborg's response to Kripke, but given that I've got this slight embarrassment about being a semantic normativist, I just wanted to flag where some disagreements may or may not occur. So we can go back to the previous slide, and I just mentioned the first point on this. Ginsborg is responding to Kripke, and Kripke's challenge to meaning, Kripke's meaning skepticism, assumes that past meaning sets the standard for current notions of correctness, and he then attacks the former. He argues that we cannot establish facts about what we meant in the past. And from that, we can't come up with a notion of current correctness. And this applies across the board, and hence we get skepticism about meaning. But Ginsborg's cunning idea is to deny that to claim that you ought to say 125 when faced with this sum is to deny that you need first to establish that you previously meant addition by plus. She doesn't think you need to do that. And if you don't need to do that, then Kripke's argument stops at the start. So she says, I want to propose that you can legitimately reply to the meaning skeptic that you ought to say 125, independently of any assumption about what you, or indeed anyone, previously meant by plus. That's going to be the claim. And in order to do that, she needs to say the next thing. She says, I maintain that there's a sense in which you ought to say 125, given the finite list of your previous uses, independent of what meaning, if any, those uses expressed. So this is how primitive normativity is going to work. It's going to be a form of normativity that underpins answering 125 as the correct response to this novel sum, independently of the idea that it turns on the idea that you previously meant familiar addition by the plus symbol or the word plus. It floats free of that. It's more primitive. It's more primitive than that. So just to keep us to say where we are, we're now on slide 15. Yeah, I'm going to 28. Slide 15 of 28. And we've been going about half an hour. Okay, I'll speed up a bit. So just a note. So although Ginsborg isn't reducing meaning to physics like Fodor, she's reducing meaning to something more primitive, a notion of primitive correctness, a primitive normativity that she's going to have to give an account of to us. And in doing this, she differs from what I've called here Crispin Wright's first thought about Kripke and McDowell's final thought about Kripke. Wright then disowns this, but his first thought about how one might reply to Kripke and McDowell's thought about how to reply to Kripke is simply to say that one remembers what one meant by the word plus or addition or the plus sign in the past. One simply remembers it. So McDowell attempts to undermine Kripkean skepticism by then dissolving the reasons why Kripke seems to think you have to reduce facts about meaning to something more basic. And it's because of that failure of reduction that Kripke has an argument for meaning skepticism. But McDowell says we can reject the reductionism and thus reject meaning skepticism. So that's a non-reductionist response to Kripke. Ginsborg, by contrast, is going to try and provide us with a halfway house, a form of reductionism, albeit not to physics. So it's a reductionist response that shows that something basic survives Kripke's dialectic, roughly, because we deny one of the premises of Kripke's dialectic. And this vaguely reminds me, say, of the way Robert Brandom suggests we should think about more basic forms of normativity than semantic normativity as a helpful philosophical project. So what Ginsborg needs to do to articulate a notion of primitive normativity which escapes Kripke's argument is to separate the idea of a normative practice from concept possession. So if she can separate these two out, then Kripkean arguments concerning concept possession simply won't touch the normativity, the primitive normativity of practice. That's the idea. So she says, as I see it, we do not first have to attach a determinate meaning to plus in order to deny that a pupil who goes on this way is going on correctly or appropriately. Goes on to say, for example, 125, or goes on to say 10, 12, 14, etc. There's something that is primitively correct or correct simpliciter about continuing the series 2, 4, 6, 8, ... up to 1,000 with 1,002. In that our taking 1,002 to be the appropriate continuation does not depend on our having specified a rule or standard with which 1,002 can be said to accord. So in other words, 1,002 is the correct thing to say when you've been counting up 2 all day long and you got to 1,000, you continue 1,002. That's the correct thing to say without presupposing a notion of having specified a rule, say the +2 rule, or a standard, the concept of +2 perhaps, with which 1,002 can be said to accord. It's more primitively correct than that, is the idea. So the way in which she sketches this out is to offer as a kind of thought experiment. Imagine a child who's familiar with the numerals and able to recite them well into the hundreds, and who has just now learnt to count by twos. That is, to recite numerals in the sequence 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. Suppose that on one occasion she recites the sequence up to 40, and then goes on, as we expect, with 42. Moreover, she does so unhesitatingly, with an apparent assurance that this is the appropriate continuation. Now we stop her. Why did you say 42? Shouldn't you have said 43 instead? Now the idea here is to open up the following possibility. It could be that she's been taught explicitly to derive the numbers by following an explicit rule that she has. But it could be, thinks Ginsborg, that she derives the numbers in the way that she does in a more primitive way than that. So these are the two possibilities that are sort of lurking in this paragraph. So here's what Ginsborg says to try and push primitive normativity. It is at least equally as likely that the child would be unable to explain or justify her having said 42. Not just because she lacked the appropriate vocabulary, but because she lacked any conception of what her saying 42 after 40 had in common with her having said 40 after 38. And yet this does not seem to rule out her reacting with surprise and puzzlement to the suggestion that she should have said 43 instead. So this is the thing that Ginsborg wants us to latch onto. It's the possibility that the child says 42 unhesitatingly, is surprised by the number of 43, but not only does she not have the vocabulary of the +2 series, she lacks any conception of what her saying 42 after 40 has in common with saying 40 after 38. That's what makes it primitive. It's not conceptually structured. She doesn't even have an inchoate grasp of the +2 rule. That's the notion. The utterance, Ginsborg continues, from her point of view, is not appropriate to the context in virtue of its conforming to a general rule, which the context imposed on her, for example, the add to rule. Rather, she takes it to be appropriate to the context simpliciter, in a way which does not depend for its coherence on the idea of an antecedently applicable rule to which it confirms. Now, if she did have that, if she had the latter, if she had an antecedently applicable rule in mind, she would have a concept, and this would be a form of conceptual normativity. But if If we deploy that, then the worry is Kripke has an argument which is going to blow out of the water our ability to lay hold to some previous conception. That's what Kripkean meaning skepticism is all about. So the idea is that if there is instead some notion which makes 42 the right thing to say independently of having a concept, then we can say that 125 is the correct answer to 57 plus 68 without worrying about the skepticism that Kripke is deploying. So primitive normativity for Ginsborg is a kind of midpoint between two other things. It's stronger than a mere dispositional parrot. Imagine that we teach a parrot and it continues 40, 42, 44, etc. Ginsborg thinks that we could have educated the parrot's sort of causal dispositional nature to provide that, but the parrot wouldn't have a sense of this being the correct thing to do. It wouldn't even be primitively normative. So primitive normativity is stronger than merely dispositions. She is, in a sense, in the same ballpark as Kripke here. Kripke, who said, as I said, his third assumption was that any philosophical account of what makes 125 the right thing to say to that sum has to make it correct. It's got to be normative. And Kripke thinks that mere dispositions aren't sufficient for that. Primitive normativity is stronger than merely dispositional accounts, but it's weaker than full-blown conceptual normativity, which Ginsborg characterizes as in this way. Here's a child with full-blown conceptual normativity instead. The child says 42 after 40 because she recognizes, although without being able to put the recognition into words, that she has been adding 2 and that 40 plus 2 is 42. Her sense of the appropriateness of what she is saying thus derives from her recognition that it fits the rule she was following, a rule which she grasps even though she's unable to articulate it. So in other words, we can imagine sort of 4 levels here. There's the person who has a rule and is able to articulate it. There is the child in this slide who has a rule even though she doesn't have a word for it. She's not a theorist of it, but still she grasps the rule. She has a concept in mind. Then we have the primitive normativity of the previous child who goes on 42, thinks that 43 is right out, but doesn't have a conception of what 42 has in common coming after 40 with 40 coming after 38. And then there's merely the dispositional parrot. Those are the 4 levels. I won't pause long because on Ginsborg's objection to dispositionalism. She doesn't deploy a dispositionalist way into conceptual normativity because she doesn't think that it's sufficiently close to concept learning. The gulf between the parrot and the full-blown linguistically articulate concept possessor is just too big. So she thinks that as well as having the right verbal dispositions, for primitive normativity, one needs also to be able to see the green things as in some sense belonging together, the class of green things that one groups together, or the numbers that we're adding in the way that we're adding. Now she's got so she doesn't like mere dispositionalism because the gap between it and concept mastery is too great. But her objection to conceptual normativity, to starting the account there, is that this doesn't seem to explain how we could ever get there in the first place. So she says, if the child needs to grasp the add 2 rule as a prior condition of being able to count by 2s, then her becoming competent in these activities could not be a way of coming to grasp the add 2 rule. In getting better at these activities, she would be getting better at manifesting her grasp of the relevant rule or concept. But for an explanation of how she had come to grasp the rule or concept in the first place, we would need to look elsewhere. And so there are shades here of Fodor's argument. Well, I've been speaking for 40 minutes or so. I'm coming towards the end now. So far, I've just been being descriptive. I've articulated the way in which Ginsborg is arguing against Kripke by spotting a novel move that no one had made before, by rejecting what Kripke presents as merely a simplifying assumption, namely that answering 125 now depends on what one meant in the past by those symbols. And Ginsborg rejects that assumption and thus blocks Kripke's argument for meaning skepticism. But in order to do that, she needs to have a notion of primitive normativity, which doesn't presuppose conceptual normativity. If she can articulate this, then she's got a way of stopping Kripke. That's the idea. But note that there's a potential difference between some of the sorts of things that she says. So considering the primitively normative student, she says she lacked any conception of what her saying 42 after 40 had in common with her having said 40 after 38. But here's another paragraph. Rather, it seems plausible to imagine her insisting with no less conviction than a child who was able to cite the add to rule was the right thing to say after 40, that it came next in the series, or belonged after 40, or fit what she had been previously doing. Now, the ambiguity in these two different ways of thinking about things seems to me to suggest two different versions of primitive normativity. For genuinely Ginsborgian primitive normativity, the child has no background conception of what it is that she's doing. That's what the first of those two paragraphs says. She lacked any conception of what her saying 42 after 40 had in common with having said 40 after 38. But it seems to me that there's also another option, which is to think that there might be a local, non-verbal, non-general conception of what's going on. This would be a local conception of primitive normativity, by contrast with a no conception version of primitive normativity. Now, in trying to work out what Ginsborg herself means, we know that because she can't mean a local conception, since that would permit the idea that making a particular move now is correct, saying 125 or saying 42, because of a conception that the child has of past moves made. Once you open that up, you open up Kripke's skeptic to ask how you identify that past conception. So given that Ginsborg is trying to offer us a novel response to Kripke, Ginsborg can't mean a local conception of primitive normativity. So she doesn't mean that. What does she mean? Well, my worry is that a no conception answer gives no room for the idea that a correct or an appropriate move depends on the game being played. In other words, it doesn't link at all to what the child conceives the child to be doing if they have no conception. It may be that some continuations of the +2 series or some additions are right out, like Monty Python's Holy Hand Grenade. But unless we have a specification of the concept, of the context, there's always going to be more than one primitively correct response that might be available, depending on what the student thinks she's doing. Is, for example, she adding to, or is she saying words that rhyme? Is she gathering together green objects, or is she gathering together square objects? So it's her conception of what she's doing that sets the standard of correctness. And without that, the standard of correctness seems brutally external to what the child is doing. In other words, it severs the connection between even primitively rule-governed behavior and intentional action. Unless the child thinks of her actions as expressive of some conception of what she's trying to do, and thus she might fail to do, how can it count as even primitively normative? How can there be that notion of correctness or incorrectness in play that is supposed to make the difference between primitive normativity and merely dispositional parrots. But also, the no conception answer in fact leaves in place some Kripkean arguments about the interpretation of the actual moves made. Because if we don't invoke the idea that the child has a conception of what the child is doing, there are all the logical possibilities of extrapolating beyond the number 40 for what the child might do next. The thing that narrows that down is what the child takes her actions to be, what rule the child thinks that she's following, however capable she may be of putting that into words. So it seems to me that we can get a sense of a difference between these two things, between in again looking at Ginsborg and a contrast, and we're coming very close to the end now. I maintain there's a sense in which you ought to say 125 to that sum, given the finite list of your previous uses, independent of what meaning, if any, those uses expressed. This is Ginsborgian primitive normativity. Whereas 42 was the right thing to say after 40, it came next in the series, or belonged after 40, or fit what she had been doing previously. This looks to me to be a local conception, a conception of what the child is doing. And this fits what Ginsborg thinks about conceptualism. Her sense of the appropriateness of what she's saying thus derives from her recognition that it fits the rule she was following. This is the second child with whom Ginsborg contrasts her own primitive first child. But it seems to me that the second child's case better articulates a reasonable view of how it might be that a notion of normativity attaches to what somebody is doing in a way that turns on how they think of what they're doing, whether or not they can articulate that in context-independent terms. So this sets up the possibility of a middle ground. On the way to context-independent linguistic expressions of rules, the child or the student articulates and expresses local conceptions of what she's doing. So in other words, it comes as a further move then to be able to think that there is a +2 rule that continues forever, as it were. That comes as a further move beyond what's been going on locally when one's going 36, 38, 40. Perhaps one has simply never thought before about what happens, as it were, at the end. What's Woody Allen's comment about eternity being an awful long time, especially towards the end? Maybe the child has simply not thought about that. Maybe the child who is gathering together green objects, one of Ginsborg's examples, is very good on really clear primary colour examples of greenness, but wouldn't know what to do with the turquoises and so on. So coming to full-blown linguistic mastery is an extension. But on the way to that, there might be a local, context-dependent specification of what she's doing. And this seems to me to be a better midpoint for language learning normativity. We explain the normativity of full-blown linguistic concepts, not on primitive normativity in a concept-independent way, but on local concepts. And a final slide. Of course, this wouldn't help Fodor. It doesn't help Fodor because a local conception is essentially a demonstrative-based account of thought. And Fodor's representational theory of mind presupposes that contents have vehicles of content, and those vehicles are mental representations. So my notion of a local conception of a somewhat less primitively normative speaker, that's not going to fit with Fodor's representational theory of mind. But that, I think, may be what distorts Fodor's argument. In other words, if you don't subscribe to a representational theory of mind, then a local conception becomes an entirely plausible way of thinking that people are inducted into the conceptual order. And if that's the case, then we can think of explicit codified conceptual mastery as based on something more primitive, not as primitive as Ginsborg's, but still more primitive than full-blown linguistic conceptual mastery. It's local conceptual mastery. And that's it. Thanks.